Hey everyone, so I'm here today making a video about stories. And as the title says, stories, stories, stories. So we're going to talk all about stories and story structure and all that jazz today. This is only the first part of what I would assume to be a multi-part series. So make sure that you tune in for some of the other videos about what else is coming up with stories. So let's go ahead and take a look at what stories are. Now, when you think about a story, I always want you to break down a story into these parts. So a story can be broken down into a who, a what, a where, a when, a why, a how. So these are the major parts. Now let me backtrack a little bit because this stuff that you see right here, the who, the what, the where, and the when, that's like the easy peasy stuff. You've been doing that literally since kindergarten. You can think back to those times when your kindergartner teacher would sit you down and say like, oh, who's in the story? And then you would say, oh, Bobo the elephant is in the story. And then your teacher would say, what does Bobo the elephant do? And you would say, oh, Bobo the elephant goes to the store. So this is some pretty basic stuff that you've been doing forever. Now, some of the more complex stuff is the why and also the how. Now, the why, you can think about that as maybe like a theme of the story, or like what is the bigger message that the story is trying to get across. That is usually going to be encompassed in the why, because every author has a why or a reason why they want to write a story before they start writing the story. Now, in addition to that, there's also the how. So we want to understand, well, how do authors, how do writers, how do creators make these themes come across? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. But again, it's going to be broken down in some future videos. So coming up next, let's start to break down the who. Who's can be people, and those are like the main characters of our stories. One of my favorite who's is Katniss from the Hunger Games series, even though, to be completely honest, I didn't really like the second and third book, but I really like Katniss as a character. Now, who's do not always have to be humans. For example, this is Momo from the Avatar The Last Airbender, who is actually also one of my favorite characters. Momo has zero spoken lines the entire series, but we do get to see a lot of character growth and character development from Momo, in addition to seeing how Momo interacts with other characters. Now, the last one is actually characters who maybe might not be real people at all. So, for example, the Force from the Star Wars series. Now, the Force isn't a character. Like, we never see the Force, but they do talk about the Force as if the Force is a character, almost like a godlike figure in that sense. So sometimes characters in stories can be completely invisible and they can just be like forces per se. So let's take a look at the what of a story now. Now, the what of a story, you've probably learned most basically is like this. So there's the exposition, there's the rising action, the climax, falling action, all that kind of stuff. But I think in reality, stories usually look a lot more like this, where there is like there are different points of rising action, there are different climaxes, and there are also different low points of a story. Now, let's compare the two. So this, I feel like this would be a lot more like kind of like your grim fairy tale type story, like Cinderella, for example. Cinderella has a pretty predictable storyline. It's pretty basic at this point. And this, I feel like, is more like the Avengers franchise series across all three movies. Now, if you look at all three movies, there is a ton of ups and downs. Like, Thanos is getting closer to getting all the Infinity Stones. Thanos is about to get all the Infinity Stones. Thanos gets all the Infinity Stones and he snaps and everyone dies. Or, I guess not dies, they get erased from existence. So, Avengers, the franchise, could be maybe more described as this. And I think most stories are described this way. Now, the other thing that we want to talk about with plot is also that plot also kind of creates plot armor for our characters. So thinking back to like Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games franchise. So Katniss Everdeen, we know as a reader that Katniss isn't going to die in the second page of the book, because then who is the book going to be about? In addition to that, the book is told from the first person, from actually Katniss's perspective. So for her to die in the second page of the book just would not make sense. We wouldn't have a character to follow anymore. Some people, of course, cough cough, George R.R. Martin, love to kill off their characters left and right. So sometimes even plot armor doesn't protect a character. But for the most part, our main character has a sort of plot armor. We know that the main character is going to survive whatever ordeals they go through because that is what the plot revolves around, is around them and their experience. Okay, so those are pretty good. Now let's talk about the where. So the where of a story has a huge impact on how that story is told. And I want to use Finding Nemo as an example. So let's look at this picture of the coral reef. So this would be an example of a very like calm and serene. Look at the sun rays literally just like breaking through the waves above, and look at the calm sway of that what is it, anemone right there, and look at how bright the colors are. It just looks so peaceful and so calm. Compare this to the anglerfish. You know, the scene where Nemo and Dory have to go look for the mask, and they go into this like pitch black part of the ocean, and that's where they meet this terrifying anglerfish, which personally I think if I encountered an anglerfish in real life, I would also be terrified. So look at how dark it is. The only light is coming from the light off of the anglerfish, and just look how terrifying the anglerfish itself looks. So compare this again to the shark tank. I guess I'll just continue to call it a shark tank, even though it's not really a tank. So the shark area, it's green, it's gritty, it's, you know, it's very unrefined. You can literally see like the fuzz of like moss and all these other things growing in that area. It just looks dirty, which kind of matches their character because their characters are kind of like gritty and, you know, they're really loud and rowdy. So you see here, the setting is doing a ton to actually change the mood of the scene. Now, lastly, we have the fish tank. So the fish tank is pretty, it's perfect. It almost looks too perfect. Like everything is laid out a little bit too perfectly where you feel a little uneasy about it. And it just looks very unnatural because it is unnatural. All those plants are fake. The volcano is fake. Everything in this shot is fake. And Pixar and Disney do a really good job of actually making sure that this feeling of fakeness comes across. And that does a lot to tell the story. It's just like where things are happening does a lot to tell the story. Now, in addition to the where, the when is also super important to the story as well. Both of these pieces come together to create what's known as a setting. And so the when. And to better understand this, I want to bring in some of my favorite examples. So let's take Futurama, for example. Futurama takes place in the future. So that means a lot of the themes and a lot of the things that we see in that story are going to be a little more futuristic. For example, Bender is a living robot, and there are a ton of other robots as well. Now, if I were to see magic happen in Futurama, I think it would be a little bit unbelievable. However, compare this with another one of my favorite shows, Disenchantment, which season 2 just came out recently, by the way. You should go check it out on Netflix if you've got a Netflix subscription. So Disenchantment. So this show, you can see like by the look of her sword and also the mace and also like a little demon dude. In addition, like he's just a straight up elf as well on the left right there. Like magic would probably be a little more believable because it looks a little more medieval, and we tend to associate magic with medieval times. So magic in this world would be a little more believable. Now, compare this lastly to Bob's Burgers, one of my other favorite shows. Bob's Burgers could literally happen down the street from us today. It has a very modern feel. The characters look very modern. The plot lines themselves are very modern. Like, we don't see robots walking around. We don't see magic happening. It's just very realistic, very down to earth. And that's one of the reasons why Bob's Burgers is so relatable to so many people. So you see, the time place of when a story takes place makes a huge difference on what can happen in the story and also what matters in the story. Okay, so all of that is like easy peas. Like you have literally been doing this since kindergarten, and if you're a kindergartner right now, well, you're about to learn how to do it in your kindergartner classes. So that is like you can do that. I know you can do that. That's like no problem. What tends to be a problem though is the why part of all of these stories. So when you think of a why, I want you to think about a message, a theme, or a moral, you know, all that jazz. And up on the screen right here, I just have some examples of themes that you might come across as a reader or as a consumer of media. Now, remember that a theme has to be a statement, so these themselves are not themes. These are ideas that can become themes. For example, the word judgment. Like we can make thousands of themes based on the word judgment, but it's a topic that themes can fall under. And theme analysis, most of you of English 11 students who have me right now, most of you have been doing theme analysis for a pretty long time. So most of you are pretty good at reading a story and coming up with a theme. So I'm not too worried about you being able to do that. Now, the more complicated part comes in is the how. So what did the creator or author do to get this message across? Because remember, like, authors and creators, they don't just magically make messages come out of their writing or their art. They have to work them in somehow, and they have to try to be intentional about what they put in their stories and their artwork, so that way people can interpret the message out of it. Now, if we were to break it down, the how always comes in the who, the what, the where, and the when. All these pieces combined is what actually creates the how. So that being said, what is a good story then? And of course, I'm going to continue using that term good story, because guess what? There are plenty of bad stories out there. I personally used to actually write awful, god-awful stories, like fan fiction and stuff. And some of the reasons why they were so bad was because I was missing the why and I was also missing the how. So a good story then, a good story has a why and uses its how, so uses its who, its what, its where, and its when, to tell the why. So one of the reasons why my stories were so bad when I was younger was because sometimes I did have the why. I did have a message I was trying to get across, but I didn't quite have the how. I would just kind of dump my why on the page and be like, look, there's my message, there's my theme, eat it up. Or sometimes I would completely miss a theme and I would have some really good how. I would have really good characters, really good plot development, really good world building. But there'd be no point to it. There's no real stakes to it. There's no real story other than, oh, some things happen. And that is one of the struggles of trying to be an author and also trying to be a creator, is you have to have a why and you have to have a how. And you have to find the balance between these two and how you get your why across while also having a really good how. So in future videos, we're going to talk a little bit more about the how, and also how you can start to take your writing up to the next level, in addition to how you can start noticing some really great hows in stories as well. So thank you for watching and stay tuned for our future videos.